Salutations, everybody. We're going to continue our reading of No Condemnation in Christ Jesus by Octavius Winslow. We're on page 9. But because the sentence, of course, breaks halfway through, we're going to continue. We're going to start off with the last sentence on page 8. There is clearly a connection between that declaration and the passage under consideration for the law of the Spirit of life, but the main difficulty seems to be in the meaning of the terms employed in the text. By some expositors, the law of the Spirit of life is interpreted of the influence or control exerted by the Spirit of God over the minds of the regenerated, emancipating them from the curse and tyranny of sin, and supplying them with a new authoritative enactment for their obedience and regulation as those whose course is guided by the Spirit. The law of sin and death is by the same authority interpreted of the contesting power of sin leading to death and condemnation, having its throne in the heart, and from its governing and despotic power maintaining a supreme and dire sway over the whole moral man. The freedom, therefore, which the law of the Spirit of life confers upon those who are bound by the law of sin and death, is just the supremacy of one principle over the force of another principle, the triumph of an opposing law over an antagonist law. But the interpretation which we propose for the adoption of the reader is that which regards the law of the Spirit of life as describing the gospel of Christ, frequently denominating a law, and emphatically so in this instance, because of the emancipation which it confers from the Mosaic code called the law of sin and death, as by it is the knowledge of sin, and through it death is threatened as the penalty of its transgression. With the brief but, we believe, correct explanation of the terms of the passage, we proceed to consider the exalted liberty of the believer in Jesus, of which it speaks, tracing the freedom and the instrument by whose agency it is secured. For the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made us free from the law of sin and death. In the preceding chapter, we were led to regard all who were outside of Christ as under a present and as exposed to a future condemnation. Not less awful in the condition of the unconverted, as depicted in the passage before us, reverse the state of the believer, and you have the exact state of the unbeliever. Is the believer in Christ a free man? The unbeliever is a slave. Is the believer justified? The unbeliever is condemned. Is the believer a living soul? The unbeliever is a lifeless soul. Is the believer a reconciled son? The unbeliever is a hostile rebel. Is the believer an heir of glory? The unbeliever is an heir of hell. Between these two conditions, there is no neutral ground. You are, my reader, either for Christ or you are against Christ. In this great controversy between Christ and Satan, you're not an indifferent and unconcerned spectator. The Prince of Light or the Prince of Darkness claims your service and presses you into the conflict. Oh, it is a matter of the greatest moment that you decide to which law you are bound, the law of life or the law of death. But in what sense is the believer free from the law of sin and death? As a covenant, he is free from it. How clear and impressive is the reasoning of the apostle on this point. Know you not, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, how that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives? For the woman who has a husband is bound by law to her husband, so long as he lives. But if the husband is dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. The believer's union to Christ, represented under the figure of a marriage covenant, frees him from the condemnatory power of this law. He looks not to it for life. He rests not in it for hope. He renounces it as a saving covenant, and under the influence of another and a higher obligation, his marriage to Christ, he brings forth fruit unto God. Was every liberty so glorious as this, a liberty associated with the most loving, cordial, and holy obedience? Not a single precept of that law, from whose covenant and curse he is released by this act of freedom, is compromised. All its precepts, embodied and reflected in the life of Christ, whose life is the model of our own, appear infinitely more clear and resplendent than ever they appeared before. The obedience of the lawgiver infinitely enhanced the luster of the law, presenting the most impressive illustration of its majesty and holiness that it could possibly receive.